Hi, everybody. Welcome to Transnational More and Panic, Neoliberalism and the Spectre of MS-13. My name is Sedna Sandoval. I am a representative from UNICA. I just want to thank you, everybody, for being here today. This is an effort together with Anak Bayong, UNICA, CAIGA, and the Central American Working Studies Group. And as a member of UNICA, I would like to talk a little bit about who we are. So we are a student-led organization. We're student-led political organization. And we seek to empower students through activism, popular education, and community organizing. And we actively against capitalism, imperialism in Central America and internationally. And if you haven't had a chance to take a look on our guiding principles, please go ahead. We have those on social media. We have them also on our webpage. But I would like to talk a little bit about one of the guiding principles, the guiding principle number 4, because it's really tied to the topic that Dr. Stephen Osuna is going to be sharing with us today. So this guiding principle is we recognize that Central American youth are being criminalized by militarized police states inside and outside the US. Therefore, UNICA is committed to supporting our youth while maintaining a critical analysis about the root causes of their criminalization while avoiding a reactionary position. So with this say, I would like us to keep an open mind. I would like us to be critical about systemic oppressions that are present around us right now, and maybe think that in the perspective of what's going on right now in Central America regarding the way that Central American governments are managing the crisis of the pandemic. So I would like also to honor all the youth that is here today, escaping a reality, but confronting a new one here in the US. So with this, I would like to pass the mic to a representative of Anak Bayan.
Oh, hi, my name is Chuck, pronouns he, him, his. I'm part of Anak Bayan at UCLA. It's a little nervous. I didn't think there'd be that many people here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Just want to thank UNICA for inviting us, as well as everyone for really helping to put on this workshop, this education, this political education. And I want to thank Stephen Osuna for giving this workshop, and for just everything. I've seen you do your work. You're amazing. Your words are just I'm so excited just because every time I see when I go to workshop with you, my eyes just light up, and then I'm just enacted to move. But yeah, I'll just give a little brief introduction about Anak Bayan. So we are an anti-imperialist youth organization fighting for national democracy with a socialist perspective in the Philippines. That's just a brief thing, but yeah, on that anti-imperialist part, we understand that imperialism, neoliberalism, imperialism being an era of late stage capitalism, right? We understand that these global issues, right? That these are global issues, right? And that it's a global virus, imperialism, neoliberalism, right? And global viruses only have global solutions, right? And the global solution is this, international solidarity, really coming together and seeing how we can enact change, and understanding that these issues are not unique to these issues are not just impacting folks in Central America, folks in the Philippines. These issues are impacting folks internationally. Just want to thank everyone for really coming, for sharing space, and then for also strengthening the anti-imperialist movement right here, right now. We're making history, just being here together, creating this change. Just want to thank everyone for bringing your energy. Yeah, I'm just really excited. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alfredo Trejo. I'm a member of CAIGA, which is the Central American Isthmus Graduate Association. We're a new organization. We just founded this past year, and echo everything that Edna and Chuck said about our guiding principles and what our beliefs are. We were created as an organization to really help Central American students, graduate students, create the scholarship and research, which is the future of Central American studies. And this is what Central American studies is all about, transnationalism, solidarity between all countries against capitalism and all forms of imperialism, and all of the isms that are holding us down. And so it's my great honor to welcome Dr. Stephen Osuna. He received his PhD in sociology with an emphasis in Black studies from UC Santa Barbara in 2015. He is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at California State University, Long Beach. His research has been published in Ethnicities, Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matters, The Futures of Black Radicalism, US Central Americans Reconstructing Memories, Struggles and Communities of Resistance, and many more. And today he's going to be giving a talk and being part of a conversation on transnational moral panic, neoliberalism, and the specter of MS-13. So thank you, Stephen, and welcome.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my page, so my screen. So give me a moment. All right. Well, again, thank you, everyone. And I'm really happy that this evening there's 119 of us sitting in this screen. I'm ready to have a good discussion about this article that I wrote. But more so, not only the article, but the political conditions that we're up against at this moment. I want to thank all the organizers for putting this together, right? Unica, Anak Bayan, UCLA, Gaiga, Central American Studies Working Group, and the Human Rights Alliance. And again, welcome and say hello to everyone on the screen. I was really happy to see all these familiar faces. It's kind of like, I haven't seen a lot of y'all, so it's nice to see you, at least on Zoom. And if I haven't met you, nice to meet you. And hopefully maybe one day we get to meet each other in person, in a rally, in a classroom, and somewhere, right? We'll see each other and get to build in person. But thank you all for being here tonight. So first of all, before I begin, I just want to say that, I'm speaking as an academic, as a professor, as a researcher, but I'm also speaking from the position of an organizer and an activist. I'm a member of the Human Rights Alliance for Child Refugees and Families, organization that's been uplifting the conditions of Central American refugees and the root causes of Central American forced migration. I'm also a member of the National Secretariat of the International Migrants Alliance, IMA, right? That's a global alliance of grassroots anti-imperialist migrant organizations. I'm also a member of the board of directors of Homies Unidos, a nonprofit organization that's working with criminalized youth here in Los Angeles. So I say that to say that the research that I'm presenting today, the conversation that I'll be having today is not just mine, right? I might have written this stuff, I might have organized this presentation, but at the end of the day, my scholarship, my thinking is collective, and it's influenced by those people around me, by the organizations around me, right? So I have to remind myself of that, and I have to remind people when I present of that. I may be a social scientist and I have research questions that are guiding my research, but I also recognize that my research is political, right? And that these are political and urgent questions that I'm asking and we're trying to get through, right? So this topic to me is really important for us to understand. But at the same time, I do want to say that this writing, this publication, and this presentation are mine, and the errors and mistakes that might happen throughout this presentation are mine alone, and it will be mine to rectify, right? So I might be guided by the perspectives and the collective vision of what we argue, but this presentation is my presentation, so any mistakes will be mine alone, right? So again, just this presentation and these ideas that I would be sharing with y'all come from a long process of development of my own political development, right? As a student organizer before I became a professor, right? Organizing Salvadoran youth, right? As we were organizing through an organization named UCL, one thing that came up that I appreciate that Edna brought up was that as we were organizing, one thing that kept on coming up was Maras, right? MS-13. And one thing that students and people around us would say is that we're happy y'all are organizing because at least we could show people that we're more than just Maras, that we're more than just MS-13, that Salvadorans are more than just MS-13. And there was always that response, right? That we're more than that, that we're more than that, and that we have to show them something else. And I get where that response was coming from, right? But for us, we recognize that that one in a way was also reacting to a problem, to the conditions, right? And so it almost was creating this dichotomy of the good Salvi and the bad Salvi, right? The good Salvi being the student that goes to school, that goes to work, that's productive, and the bad Salvi being the criminal, the marero. And we're like we can't do that, right? It's almost like that dichotomy of the good immigrant and the bad immigrant. And so as organizers, we wanted to politicize and educate our communities about, well, what are the root causes of the development of MS-13, of maras, of gangs in El Salvador, right? So this perspective and this urgency to understand this is where this presentation is coming from. And, you know, like I mentioned, this article was developed and published in a journal called Race and Class. And it's a journal that's just came out. The article came out in February of this year, digitally. And it was supposed to come out, the paper copy was supposed to come out in April, but because of COVID-19, it stays digital, right? But, you know, I'm really proud that this article was not only accepted in this journal, in this online, in this academic journal, but that it was also made the front cover, right? And they asked me, you know, we would like you to be part of the front cover of the article. And for me, that wasn't only something that was big for me, but as someone that's part of an emerging field of Central American studies, to me, that's putting Central American studies in the front of Race and Class, right? And really propping that up for us, right? So to recognize that critical scholarship is coming from Central Americans and about Central America. So it was really important for me to be there. And I know that this article is academic and there's a paywall to access it. So let me stop sharing. I do want to share it with everyone. In the chat, I will put my Dropbox link. So if you click on that, you'll actually have the article. So because I would love for you to read it and tell me what you think. And that way, you know, again, like I said, I know there's a paywall and it's difficult to access academic journals. You know, there's obviously this wall that prevents people to access knowledge. So, you know, there's the link. Click on it, download it, read it. Tell me your criticisms. Tell me what you thought was important. Tell me what you thought was just not good, right? So share that with me. I really appreciate that. Let me go back to sharing my screen. So again, I think this is an important journal because again, Race and Class, for those that are academics or students or graduate students, undergraduate students in the conversation right now, Race and Class is one of the most important anti-imperialist academic journals out there, right? There ain't that many anti-imperialist journals, right? There's journals that just want to promote academia, but this journal really promotes critical and radical scholarship. And I really recommend that if you're interested in that type of work, to look at this journal, look at it in the academic libraries. You could see them there. So I do want to start from the position as a sociologist that also builds from the perspectives of Marx and Karl Marx and Marxism. This framing that I'm talking about today in this article comes from a Marxist tradition, and it builds off of that, right? And obviously, there's something we could debate about the merits of Marxism, but we could, you know, for the sake of this article presentation, this is the way that I'll be doing it. So this quote comes from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and it's an important essay that Marx wrote that I really recommend all y'all to read. It's accessible online. But he has this quote in the beginning of the essay. Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historical facts and personages occur, as it were, twice. He has forgotten to add, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. And for me, that stood out really importantly in this last elections of Donald Trump and the criminalization or the bringing up of MS-13 again. Because if we've read or studied the origins or understand Salvadoran history, we recognize the mass refugee displacement during the Civil War, the development of Salvadoran communities in Los Angeles, right? The deportations, mass deportations of people, right? We recognize the criminalization of our communities. That the first time this happened, that they started creating a moral panic over MS-13, it was a tragedy. It was a tragedy that our youth were criminalized, that people were criminalized to hide, to mask the conditions that people were up against. This second time that Trump's bringing it up, that Bukele is bringing it up, it's a complete farce, right? So the first time that it disappeared, for the first time that people were criminalized was a tragedy. And this second time is a complete farce. And this is what really guided my thinking when I was developing this article and this argument. So sorry to trigger y'all with this picture, but it is an important thing to bring up. When Trump was elected president in 2016, For some reason, Time Magazine decided to elect him Person of the Year. I'm sure they'll probably regret it, or who knows, maybe they still believe that that holds true. But in this interview, in the interview of the profile, he shared with the Times reporter a copy of the Long Island tabloid Newsday, which had a front page story headlined "Extremely Violent Gang Faction." He followed by saying, "They come from Central America. They're tougher than any people you've ever met. They're killing and raping everybody out there. They're illegal and they're finished." Right? Obviously, he was referring to MS-13, right? A street gang with origins in 1980s Los Angeles, but now found in El Salvador and throughout Central America. In his first year in office, Trump signed Executive Order 13773, directing the Secretary of State, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice to prioritize targeting transnational criminal organizations. They are, he argued, the drivers of crime, corruption, violence, and misery. Let's focus on the word drivers. They're the drivers of all this. During his first and second State of the Union address, and throughout his presidency, Trump has brought up MS-13, stating that the members of this street gang have taken advantage of loopholes in the prior Obama administration's immigration laws by entering the country as quote unquote unaccompanied alien minors, and were causing a national security crisis. Again, we've heard the word unaccompanied minors before, given the situation that happened in 2014. Trump decides to add the word alien in there. Unaccompanied alien minors, right? Think about the Trump's language, the use of this panic that I want to talk about, right? So as I mentioned, he created these executive orders, right, to go after this transnational criminal organization. And one of those parts was obviously, he mentioned he wanted the State Department to go after them, right? So he sent former Attorney General Jeff Sessions to El Salvador, right? He's no longer the Attorney General, but he was at a moment, and if you remember the interviews and speeches that he gave, you know, this is a xenophobe, right? Racist, white supremacist coming from the South, right? If you watch his interviews. So he goes to El Salvador and he's going and looking at the conditions of crime and the gangs, right? And he attends the ILEA, which is the International Law Enforcement Academy, which is a policing academy created by the United States in El Salvador that trains police across Latin America. So the police get trained in El Salvador, right? From all over Latin America through this ILEA. So he was attending a graduation of the ILEA, and he says this in that graduation: "Today we are gathered not far from the headquarters of the most vicious and brutal gangs on earth, known as MS-13. MS-13 is based here in El Salvador, but its tentacles reach across Central America, Europe, and through 40 US states, and to within yards of the US Capitol." Again, tentacles, unauthorized alien minors, right? Unaccompanied alien minors, right? But this idea of tentacles, they're almost taking that phrase from us, because when we talk about imperialism, we're talking about its tentacles, right? But now they're talking about MS-13 and its tentacles, right? So again, this framing that these two were creating wasn't new, though, right? And this is what we need to think about. These framings of MS-13 are not new, right? They're regurgitated framings. Because if we go back to National Geographic's in 2006, ABC's Nightline in 2016, there's always been this construction of what MS-13 is, right? This idea of MS-13, yeah? This knowledge that's being produced of what we think. I remember when I was in graduate school, and you know, Netflix started becoming popular, this documentary on MS-13 was one of the most popular online. You know how you could choose, you could look at what's popular? This was trending, right? So many people were watching it and creating this hysteria of what it was, of what MS-13 was. Now the thing is, and I just read a bit here, right? Although MS-13 has been used as a priority for the Trump administration to further criminalize immigration and justify the expansion of the border wall between the US and Mexico, the specter of MS-13 is not a new phenomenon. Rather, it has been a recurring, quote, transnational gang crisis between the US and El Salvador. Because of street gangs like MS-13, as well as ongoing police and gender-based violence, let's focus on that too, right? Not just violence of maras, but police violence and gender-based violence, right? El Salvador has become a country with the highest rates of homicides and femicides in the world. This violence has exacerbated both internal and external displacement, forced migration, and asylum seeking along the US southwestern border. Like much of the mainstream media and personal accounts of asylum seekers, the arguments about violence emerging from street gangs in El Salvador from Trump administration are based on real conditions. But what is often missing are the root causes of these material conditions. Specifically, economic, political, and ideological contradictions have shaped the terrain of this gang situation to develop and violence to develop and continue to collide, right? So I think this is important to think about this long history of not only the development of what we think a gang member is, that has history with the black gangs and Chicano gangs in Los Angeles, right? And the construction of the gang member and the Zoot Suiter, right? All these histories developed to then we see the development of how we see Salvadorans, particularly to Salvadorans, right? Particularly to Salvadoran youth. But again, like I wanted us to think about that these accounts that Trump says, that Jeff Sessions say, that we hear, that we might even hear from our family members, they're actual conditions. They're talking about real conditions, right? So sometimes even as much as some people might say, I don't agree with Trump, they're almost aligning themselves with how they talk about MS-13, right? How they talk about how vicious they are, how violent they are, how they kill everybody. Those are conditions that they're hearing about in actual material conditions. But what's oftentimes missing causes around what created these conditions, what perpetuate these conditions. And I think for me, this is something that I wanted to understand, right, and develop, right? And so the argument of this article that I share with y'all, right, and just in the easy terms here, the argument that I make that MS-13 has become what I call transnational moral panic that masks global capitalist crisis in El Salvador and Central America, right? Masks, meaning that there's a crisis of a global economic system in this region. And the focus on MS-13 masks it, ignores it, hides it, right? We don't even get to talking about it because we get so caught up and boggled down with the material conditions of violence that we're seeing. Because it's actual violence that exists, but we don't see what's continuously maintaining it, right? So what I'm arguing is this moral panic, and I'll discuss what I mean by that, and its development, right? And just to share that this article, again, like I mentioned before, right, that this writing that I did was based on all my participation as in these organizations, but also as a researcher between 2010 and 2016, that I've traveled between Los Angeles and San Salvador and El Salvador, right? So back and forth and interviewing people and reading documents and studying the conditions on the ground, right? So what I want to make in this argument are these points. That to understand this moral panic, this conditions of El Salvador, we have to understand the limits of a Salvadoran revolutionary process. That there was a civil war, which we should think of as a revolutionary process, that didn't meet where it was supposed to get to, right? And we could still argue, we could debate that soon and talk about, well, does it need to get to that, right? But there was a limit to this revolutionary process. The development of a neoliberal Salvadoran state, and I'll describe what I mean by a neoliberal, right? But the neoliberal Salvadoran state. A globalized Salvadoran political economy, right? That the economy of El Salvador has globalized itself, meaning that it's no longer about developing the nation, but it's actually extracting capital coming in and leaving, and actually abandoning the people there. And the development of US Salvadoran law and order, racialized politics. And I'll talk about these racialized politics, again, these conceptions of what a marero is, right? But these are some things that I want us to think about when we think of the development of this moral panic that I'm talking about, but also the development of the conditions that we're up against in El Salvador right now, right? The situation that we're seeing, right? A neoliberal state that's hollowed out, right? A revolutionary process that's still ongoing, that had its limits, right? A political economy that's globalized, right? And the development and promotion of law and order policies, right? Policies that are mano dura, that I'll discuss in a bit. So to think about these things, right, are important. So rather than point, as many do, to US foreign policy as the primary culprit of MS and gang violence, I argue that the moral panic has obscured the results of the transformation of the global economy and its effects in El Salvador, the Central American region, and US cities like Los Angeles. The conditions for a local LA street gang of Salvadoran war refugees, as MS-13 for instance, to become a so-called transnational security threat must be understood within the structural changes of the world capitalist system and the local effects on the ground. So oftentimes we hear U.S. foreign policy created MS-13, U.S. foreign, and that what happens with that is that it's limited, because we should be thinking about the capitalist system that the U.S. foreign policy is a part of, right? U.S. foreign policy is an element of it, but what created these conditions is a global capitalist system. It's a system in decline, as Chuck was talking about earlier, right? So the punitive populism, and I'll describe what I mean by that, deployed in El Salvador with the support of the U.S. state, has targeted a marginalized relative surplus population, and I'll describe all these terms in a bit, that has been deprived of any access to the wealth and resources of the country, right? So the focus of these law and order politics and a punitive populism has been on this relative surplus population of MS-13. Their form of survival through gang violence, robbery, drug dealing, extortion is predicated on the emergence of a neoliberal state after the attempted revolution in the 1980s. However, and I want to emphasize this, however, their violence will never equal the viciousness of what neoliberalism and transnational capital have produced for the majority of the country: alienation, domestic uncertainty, and desperation, right? We need to understand that aspect, that the violence that we see, which is real, which we read about, we hear about from our family members, right? From people that have sought asylum here. I've talked about this violence, but violence is predicated on a neoliberal society, on a system that tells you, do it on your own, survival of the fittest, figure it out with us, right? If you tell a society to figure it out on your own, what do you expect, right? And this is what I want us to try to understand when we think of the violence that's happening and the conditions around it. And fundamentally, the tragedy of national criminalization. And this doesn't just engulf MS-13, it engulfs the refugees, it engulfs asylum seekers, it engulfs the Mexican state going after Central American migrants, right? This transnational criminalization that's crossing borders and criminalizing people, right, uses MS-13 as the argument to go after and criminalize people, right? They're arguing that they're trying to protect migrants, but they're also criminalizing migrants and refugees. So this farce of Trumpism and what Allah is starting to call buquelazo, right, is what we need to understand in this current moment. So when we think of the literature on MS-13, so this is the academic aspect of it, right? Let's talk about what has been written. But first, I want to focus more on like the common sense stuff that's been written, right? And usually what you hear is the MS-13 started in Los Angeles by Salvadoran youth fleeing civil war who were then deported and took LA gang culture to war-torn El Salvador. They then multiplied and created a transnational security threat. Now, gang culture, right? I want us to think about that. Usually we hear that, right? That gang culture was taken to El Salvador as if the problem was a culture. And as sociologists that I study radical criminology and study poverty, there's been development that I'll talk further about, the idea of a culture of poverty, right? Or broken homes. That the problem of the poor is not that they're poor or that the economic system's making them poor, it's their culture, right? They just need to work harder. They just need to save. They just haven't been taught economic stability, right? And so this idea of LA gang culture being sent down there, and that's what created the problem that we're seeing. Masks rather than reveals a lot of the things that we need to talk about, right? So this, you read this, and I have a lot of friends that laugh at me, but I watch Fox News. They say this. So this is not as progressive as it sounds. Fox News says it, CNN says it, the LA Times say it, anybody says it now, because it's so long back in history that you could say it now without being, calling the US blamed for it, right? So like you could say this, oh yeah, there was a war, people came, they started gangs, right? Because at the end of the day, it's still about the LA gang culture, that's the problem, right? So there's been a lot of critical response to that. A lot of scholarship has been, which is good, right? And one of them was Alana Zilberg that wrote that, this construction of a transnational gang crisis and neoliberal security scapes to understand MS-13, right? that this construction of a transnational gang crisis, but more so than that, that neoliberal policies of security, of securitization, right, of militarization, is what perpetuates the cycle of gangs, right? Gonzalez talked about this idea of an imputed gang identity, right? That when people were deported from the United States to El Salvador, they carried with them this imputed gang identity, that they were already labeled a gang member before they even got to El Salvador, right? That created a transnational system of migration control. Marcus Michael Muller, right, talks about this idea of a transnational penal apparatus, right? That there's this apparatus of criminalization that continually exacerbates violence, right? Because it's continuously criminalizing people from Los Angeles, Mexico, and Central America, and it just continues, right? Jose Miguel Cruz talked about a violent state as the producer of violent conditions, right? That if we want to understand violence in Central America, specifically El Salvador, you have to understand the state. That the state's always been violent and it continues to reproduce the violence, right? So we have to understand that. And finally, Sonja Wolf talked about the policies of mano dura, which were the policies that were enacted by right-wing governments to go after gangs, were actually a right-wing political strategy to win votes, right? That it was a mano duras were policies that just to gather votes as to show themselves that they were strong on crime, right? That they weren't weak on crime, that they weren't going to negotiate with terrorists, that they were going to put the law on these criminals, right? Because they're the cause of our degradation in El Salvador, right? So to add to that, I think, you know, all that stuff has been important, but I think one thing I want to develop from all those perspectives is the development of a moral panic. And I have a definition here from Stuart Hall, who I built from in the scholarship of a moral panic, and what the definition is. So let me read it. A moral panic, it represents a way of dealing with what are diffuse and often unorganized social fears and anxieties. It deals with those fears and anxieties not by addressing the real problems and conditions which underlie them, but by projecting and displacing them onto the identified social group. That is to say, this is the important part, the moral panic crystallizes popular fears and anxieties, which have a real basis, and providing them with a simple, concrete, identifiable social object seeks to resolve them, right? So a moral panic develops amongst a lot of things. The drug war, for example, was a moral panic, right? We could think, like, since we're talking with Anak Bayan here, the drug war with Duterte, the moral panic over drugs, right? And the drugs in the Philippines has become this moral panic that he uses to ignore the actual root causes of the problems and is using it to justify the extrajudicial killings, right? So in El Salvador, the moral panic I was arguing is the marero, right? Because it is that social object that we can identify that produces all these unorganized social fears and anxieties. Because they're actual social fears and anxieties. They have a real basis, right? This is not to ignore the basis of them. They're real. But what it does is it crystallizes them, meaning it just makes them solid, right? Crystallizes popular fears and anxieties, and then uses them to justify the violent actions by the state, right? The law and order policies of militarization and over-policing and mass incarceration, right? To do these things. And as I was reading this idea from Stuart Hall, right, it obviously comes from his a famous book called Police in the Crisis. Luckily, I'm next to my library. This is the book. Very important book for us to read. I think if you want to understand criminalization under capitalism, this is a very important book to think about. In the book, he talks about mugging in London and argues that the mugger became the crisis of hegemony. It became the embodiment of the crisis of capitalism in British society, right? That capitalism was the crisis, but that the media, the elites, the politicians were using the mugger, black youth, as the problem of society, right? So this crisis of hegemony, and the hegemony, if you want to understand hegemony, you should really read Stuart Hall, of dominant ideas of the world, right? The mugger became that crisis in that moral panic. But again, for me, the moral panic to think about is the marero, right? Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who wrote about prisons, who writes about prisons in California, really important scholarship on the development of prisons, right, in California, argues that Nixon's law and order was a moral panic, right? Richard Nixon, when he went up for the presidency, right, he started blaming the crisis of U.S. imperialism, the war in Vietnam, the bombing in Cambodia, all that stuff, he was blaming the social movements as the problem, right? The drug war that he developed, right, was used to create this hysteria that middle class society was tripping out on, right? Because they're like, there's social movements on the ground seeking change in the United States. What is all this about? Well, he was like, you know what? No, it's not, it's the drug users. It's the anti-war movement, the Black Power movements that are using drugs. That's the problem. And he created this whole law and order hysteria around it, right? To go after the movement, and we're living with the conditions of it to this day, right? When we talk about the mass incarceration and drug wars, and not even that the drug war is the result of mass incarceration, right? But the use of prisons as a solution to political and economic problems, right? Tony Samara was another author that talked about the idea of white anxieties over street children in post-apartheid Africa. Another one, right? Thinking about how the white anxiety over street children in post-apartheid Africa, South Africa, instead of thinking of street children as, why are they street children in the first place? Why are they homeless, houseless? Why, they created this whole idea of development, right? In order for us to develop the society, we need to go after these street children and lock them up, right? And finally, when thinking of Los Angeles, the development after the LA uprising, right? The policing of South Central and Pico Union, right, relied on neoliberal racial security regimes, right, through a moral panic of homelessness, of poverty, right, that was oftentimes very racialized, right, and very racist, right? So when thinking about the moral panic, I wanted us to think of it as transnationally, though, right? And I say that it's transnational because it's crossing borders. It's not just in El Salvador, and it's not just in the United States, but it's crossing the borders. And I mean by this, that the knowledge that's produced from material conditions across borders, right? The experiences of poverty and gang violence that's across borders is producing this panic, right? Producing the conditions to develop an object to police and control, right? So maras, or the MS-13 gang member, right? Which the word oftentimes in Spanish is maras, mareros, embodies the fears and anxieties from a neoliberal crisis of reproduction. And what I mean by that is that neoliberal capitalism and a neoliberal state requires that you figure it out on your own, like I said earlier. Right? Neoliberalism is this political ideology about the strength of the free market, the strength of private property, right? Of a smaller state that doesn't provide social services, that you pay for your social services, that you pay for your education, right? That you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, pretty much, right? When a society develops that culture, that perspective from the conditions, there's a crisis of reproduction, because the idea of a welfare state or of a state is to provide resources, it's to provide social services, it's to provide healthcare, to provide benefits to you, right? That's the development of a state, right? But when the state's neoliberal, it's not supposed to provide that. All it provides is prisons and jails and policing, right? So you need to figure your reproduction on your own. And when I mean by reproduction, I don't just mean like child reproduction, having a baby, but like social reproduction, the everyday things you do to exist, right? The everyday things you have to do to live, right? Brush your teeth, make food, right? Clean your house, which oftentimes is very gendered, right? When we think of domestic work, right? But the crisis of social reproduction is a situation in El Salvador where there isn't a state that's providing benefits for the people, right? And the conditions of precarity, the conditions of alienation that are happening in El Salvador are embodied in the fears and anxieties of MS-13. So MS-13 becomes that fear, that thing to focus on, because the neoliberal state is not something that we focus on. We focus on the violence that people are living with every day, right? But that violence that they're living every day is predicated on this crisis of reproduction. And this is a byproduct in turn reinforces common sense notions of criminality, right? And what I mean by that sense, common sense notions of criminality, that all of us could talk about this idea of when we hear what a criminal is. When you talk to people that, the everyday folks, what is a criminal? They'll tell you, oh, someone that robs you, someone that hangs in a corner, gang members, like my mom says, manos, right? The idea of what a criminal is. And these things become common sense, right? But they become common sense to the point where then it evades the critique of capitalist social relations, right? We never get to talk about the root cause, because we get caught up talking about the surface of the root causes, right? Because at the end of the day, the critique should be of capitalist social relations, right? The social relations that develop the society we live in is what we need to critique. And those are fundamentally developed by capitalism, right? The relations of exploitation are what drive the society that we're seeing. Even in this current moment with COVID-19 in the United States, right? That they're pushing people to go back to work. Right? They're not pushing, that people are not going back to work because they want to work. Like this idea that we have to go out, right? Because people feel like they need to be workers, right? Like this condition that exists here, right? So these evade of a capitalist social relations because we're so focused on the criminality of the country. Right? So example, when we hear people fleeing poverty and violence, that is a common thing we hear when we talk about El Salvador and Central American countries. Why are people leaving? They're fleeing poverty and violence. Right? And oftentimes when you keep push further, well, what does the poverty and violence come from? Well, it's because of the gangs. Right? It's MS-13 in those neighborhoods that are creating the violence. And people can't go to work and they're in poverty because they're stuck between the gangs. But the capitalist social relations are what producing poverty. Poverty exists because there's a small wealthy class that impoverishes so many other people. And when there's poverty, there's violence. Violence emerges out of desperate conditions, right? And so out of those conditions, there's a criminalization of a transnational relative surplus population as a solution to the crisis of global capitalism in this region, right? And so what I mean by this surplus population comes from Marx's perspective on capitalism, capitalist accumulation. And what he says is that capitalism in its development and in the accumulation of wealth, there's gonna, as capitalism continues to accumulate, capital continues to accumulate on one pole, there will be a complete deprivation of the other pole, right? So all this wealth developing here will eventually create a condition where people are pushed out of the economic system, are pushed out of the productive system, right? Where there's no longer need for workers because all this wealth is being developed here, that you're actually creating the conditions for there to be a surplus population, a population that's redundant to the system, right? And so what I'm arguing here is that the MS-13 is an element of that surplus population, right? Oftentimes, we hear about like migration, right? So when migrate from a country, they're a surplus population. There's no jobs, there's no work for them, right? So there's a segment, right? This is a sector of the surplus population that is being criminalized, right? In Los Angeles, we could think of the informal economy. Right? People that are working in the informal economy could be seen as a surplus. The houseless people could be seen as a surplus, right? And this is a concept that's commonly used to talk about the prison expansion, that the surplus was incarcerated, right? So this idea, I want us to think about how we can conceive of MS-13 youth that are being abandoned by the neoliberal society, and young adults that are being abandoned, that then develop their own social reproduction, right? Are being criminalized, yeah? So I took this picture that you see here in 2013 when I was down there, and it really represented what I'm trying to understand in this, right? The potential for peace has been locked away. Right? When we look at this picture, the dove represents peace. And a lot of our anti-war movements, the dove represents peace, right? And so when we look at these conditions and we look at what I'm trying to get us to understand, this cage, it's caging peace, right? Our response to a society based on a capitalist exploitation is denying the ability for people to live dignified and peaceful lives, right? And instead of people really focusing on that aspect, the moral panic over the situation that they're dealing with is focused more on the mareros, right? On MS-13. And this then becomes a transnational threat, right? Not only in the United States, as Trump was talking about, but other politicians have talked about, right? Not in Mexico, right? In Central America, and we see it on the social media, like I was mentioning with the National Geographics and all these other episodes of these documentaries, right? So again, the primary contradiction of capitalism, right? The accumulation of wealth of one class requires the complete deprivation and misery of another, right? The accumulation of wealth of one class requires the complete deprivation and misery of another. And that other fights amongst itself, right? Because as long as the accumulation stays here, things are rough over here, right? So I wanted us to think about it in those terms when we're thinking about this. So in a historical context, though, the seeds of MS-13 are found in oligarchic rule, US imperialism, neoliberal restructuring in the global South, and the struggles for national liberation in Central America on the one hand, and the racialized police repression and neoliberal restructuring of Los Angeles on the other. And again, it's oftentimes not heard that way when we think of the roots of the situation. And when we look at the historical context, one interviewee that I was talking to really put it succinctly in this point. The politics of securitization always respond to conjunctures. And what I mean by that is conjunctures are moments, right? The word conjunction means moments. So the politics of security, of militarization respond to moments, right? And so when we're looking at the historical context of El Salvador, right, we have to see the development of a repressive Salvadoran state, that the state was developed as a repressive state. And we look at that, and I focus more on the primitive accumulation and vagrancy laws. And what I mean by primitive accumulation was the development of the enclosure movement, the enclosures of land in El Salvador, right? Where the oligarchy began to take control of lands for their cafeteleras, right? For their coffee plantations, right? And created vagrancy laws. So once people were pushed off lands, right? Once communal lands were abolished, right? They created vagrancy laws, right? To go after those that had been displaced, predominantly indigenous people, right? That were pushed off of communal lands. Now these vagrancy laws were a way of criminalizing poverty, criminalizing conditions that people were living, right? That you, first of all, you pushed us off our lands, and now you're calling us vagrants, right? And these vagrancy laws were then used to push people back into these plantations to work, right? So this was this development of unequal land distribution in El Salvador. Now, when you see the development of this in this situation, you start to organize. And always, one thing that we always have to remember, right? Where there's repression, there's resistance, right? Where there's people, where there's the state and capital repressing, there's always resistance. And I always try to tell my students that we shouldn't just think about repression. We should think of repression as a response to resistance. That resistance is always there, right? That it's in us to resist, right? And so the state and capital always responds to that resistance, right? So in this moment, you see the mobilization and development of a movement in the early 20th century, right? And the 30s, right? Organizing, right? And we have the development of this, but again, the response from the state, right? And what is commonly known as la matanza, right? The mass killing of over 30,000 people, right? Specifically indigenous people, right? And I have a picture of Feliciano Ama here to represent Feliciano, right? That he was one of the leaders that was killed in this moment, right? And this was predominantly indigenous people that were killed, right? Because this argument of them resisting their displacement, resisting their exploitation and their oppression. Right? The response to that was a military dictatorship, right? From the 30s to the 70s, right? And again, that doesn't mean that there wasn't social movement mobilization happening at the same time, but that there was a military dictatorship that ruled the country and people organizing against it at the same time, right? And this back and forth, this dialectical struggle in this country developed into a civil war, or again, a Salvadoran revolution, a revolutionary process developed, right? And then when I mean revolutionary process, is that there was groups that were thinking revolution in the country, that the only solution to the conditions of exploitation and oligarchic rule was revolution, right? And the revolutionary forms of armed struggle, right? That the solution was armed struggle in those conditions. This produced, again, a civil war where the US backed the Salvadoran state, right? With US foreign policy, and there's so many documentaries and so many literature about the US involvement in Central America, right? And specifically in El Salvador, yeah? But I think for me, we could understand what was happening in El Salvador in this moment through the ideas of Ignacio Martin Baro, who was a Jesuit priest who was actually assassinated in the 80s during the Civil War. And he had this idea of social normal abnormality, that the conditions in El Salvador were producing a social normal abnormality. He was a Jesuit priest, but also social psychologist. But it's like his psychology was about liberation psychology, that you can't understand the mind of an individual if you don't understand their conditions, right? So he had this idea that he called social normal abnormality that was producing in the society, right? That things were just producing structural misery in the population, right? that there was a structural misery that was also producing a social trauma, a psychosocial trauma in the population, right? At this war, at this civil war, but specifically the U.S.-backed military and death squads, that their response to the revolutionary movement was producing this psychosocial trauma in the country, right? This produced the first wave of Salvadoran refugees to the U.S., right? This is the first large exodus of people in the 1980s, right? And what a lot of us argue now, we see more people migrating now under these conditions today of neoliberalism than happened in the war. But this was the first moment that we see a large flow of people being displaced from the country, right? From the countryside into the urban, into the urban out to other countries around the United States, Mexico, and other Central American countries around there, right? So again, this social normal abnormality that was developing because of war, right? But I wanted to emphasize the role of the repressive state in producing this, not the revolutionary movement, but the repressive state, right? Because even when we look at the UN reports arguing that who was the one causing the human rights violation, predominantly it was the state, right? And its death squads. This pushed a lot of people to leave El Salvador, right? And a lot of people came to Los Angeles. And this is oftentimes where the story takes place of the development of MS-13 in Los Angeles, right? So in Los Angeles, though, in this context, we have to understand there was an actual neoliberal restructuring of the city. And what I mean by that, neoliberalism, again, like I mentioned, is the promotion of free markets and property rights through structural adjustment, austerity measures, and the privatization of public goods and deregulation of industry and capital flow. Fundamentally meaning cut social programs, cut education, cut healthcare, emphasis private property, emphasize the free market, right? And again, you figure things out on your own. Yeah, this was happening in Los Angeles in the 80s. Right? So when we think of the LA uprising in 1992, this was the result. Yeah, Rodney King was the match that lit the fire, but the fire it was developing because of a neoliberal restructuring of the city. Right? And what was happening? It was being the industrialization. All these factories that were once in Los Angeles left because of globalization, global capitalism, right? Neoliberalism allowed for capital to be deregulated and leave the country, right? It was no longer controlled by the state. It could leave, right? There was an economic recession because of that, high unemployment rates, right? Rampant police violence in this area of MacArthur Park, of South Central, where people were arriving, right? For example, in 1990-91, the California economy lost 730,000 jobs, with 548,000 coming from Southern California alone. 27% of jobs lost in that era came from Los Angeles, right? I mean, 27% of the nation's job losses came from Los Angeles, right? So this was a period of precarity, of austerity measures in Los Angeles, right? And I mentioned rampant police violence. And it's funny because I'm saying rampant, but it was Rampart, right? So the Rampart Police Department was producing rampant police violence, right? So right now, there's an issue happening in Boyle Heights with a police officer named Frank Hernandez. And I'm sure if you look up in the news or you look online, there's this police officer that was caught on videotape beating this one guy that he had detained, right? This guy's notorious in this area, right? He already had killed a Guatemalan street day laborer, Manuel Camina Shroom, in 2010, right? An indigenous man that was shot twice in the head, right? This police violence that was happening in the 80s that happens today obviously has its history in the development of the police, right? But in this area of Rampart, the police had complete control of the area, right? They had total control through their gang units, right? Through their gang injunction laws, right? Through Operation Hammer, right? All these policies that gave open discretion to the police to act as an occupied force in this area, right? And specifically, they started targeting Salvadoran youth, refugee youth, right? And so these youth that had arrived from Los Angeles, from El Salvador to this area, right? It's oftentimes the way we hear it, right? That Salvadoran youth were bullied by Mexican gangs, by black gangs, so they have to organize themselves and respond that way, right? That's what's happening on the ground. But behind that was this, right? Pico Union, 35% poverty rate and 11% unemployment rate, right? Central American migrants and Mexican migrants earned only two-thirds of what white men earned in the city, right? If we think about gender, that was even lower for migrant women. So these conditions that put the situation for the Salvadoran youth to arrive, where Mexican youth were already dealing with poverty, Black youth were dealing with poverty, these youth showed up to a situation of even further poverty, right? So the development of these gangs is this origin of MS-13 starts to happen here. And from the interviews I've done with folks, what I've heard is that MS-13 started as a group of heavy metal folks, right? This idea of doing this was they're heavy metal rockers, right? And that the police started profiling them as gang members. People started profiling them as a gang, right? My brother came of age during this era, and he was a heavy metal dude. He loved Iron Maiden and Metallica and all that music, right? So he dressed that way and went to Belmont High School. And he has stories that tell me that they always did ask him if he was MS-13. Right? This construction already of this idea of the heavy metal dude was MS-13. But eventually, this started to change because of the police racial profiling of this youth, right? And being locked up into the system and developed into the system, right? That it started to become what we know today, right? So the Salvadoran youth and their families left a country whose social fabric had been torn apart due to psychological and physical warfare, only to arrive to a city whose social fabric was also crumbling due to economic restructuring, right? So think about that psychosocial trauma that I'm talking about. That they leave a war-torn country, a psychological warfare, physical warfare, to a city that's crumbling, economically crumbling for the poor, right? But again, neoliberalism works that way where the poor are dealing with, but the wealth is going upward, right? So the wealthy in the city were fine, but the impoverished and folks in poverty were dealing with it on the ground, right? So that was happening in this period. And thinking about the work of Cecilia Menjivar, Lacey Abrego, right, Esther Hernandez, that talk about the experience of migrants, Salvadoran migrants in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, right? But I want to connect that to the work of scholars like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, right? Mike Davis, Cedric Robinson, Clyde Woods, right? That talk about the conditions of LA too, right? Let's put those two things together to understand what migrants were arriving to, right? What were they arriving to? What were the Chicano community, the Black community dealing with already when Salvadorans arrived? That created even this situation that we're thinking about today, right? Roberto Lovato, a journalist that's about to come out with a book, talks about this era. He's around. He lived in this era, and it would be interesting to see his take on this topic, right? Because he was around this situation, not necessarily in Los Angeles. He was in the 90s, but this period that developed in that I'm trying to understand, right? So again, war happening here and economic restructuring happening over here, right? So this situation created these conditions of what we're seeing today. Talking to Alex Sanchez from Homies Unidos, Mirna Solorzano, right? Folks that I've talked to about these conditions and what they dealt with as being profiled by Rampart Police Department, right? That how they were treated by Rampart Police Department, where they had, again, complete autonomy to police and harass and control people. And it wasn't until the Rampart scandal where they got caught. And it wasn't mean that the Rampart scandal in the late 90s, where the police got caught with corruption, it wasn't that it was just happening then, it's been happening, right? And they just finally got caught, right? The same thing like the Rodney King beating, right? That video just finally caught them, but this was an ongoing process, right? So Salvadoran youth that arrived to the situation had to deal with it. Yes. Now, one of the interviews that I did in El Salvador, I mentioned this point, right? The FMN didn't have enough bullets to change the economic system. And what he was trying to say by that is that this revolutionary process met up with the state, right? It was a strong revolutionary movement, right? But it didn't get to the point of taking state power, right? Because it ended with the peace accords in 1992, right? So this peace accords ended the conflict, right? But it ended the conflict in capital terms. And what I mean by that, there was a transformation of the Salvadoran state, right? That there was a neoliberal restructuring of the state at this moment, right? Where there was an oligarchic rule that figured it out that it couldn't no longer make its wealth off of the land, right? It couldn't make its wealth off of coffee anymore. So it had to figure out other ways to make its wealth. And it was through financial capital, through global capital, right? To open up, to expand the economy, right? To open up the economy to global finance, right? And that required privatization of resources, the deregulation of the economy, and austerity measures, right? Cutting social services. So this happening at the same time that the Revolutionary War was ending, there was a development of this, what I talked about, this neoliberal state in El Salvador, right? So think about this, right? When you start to when you start to privatize the national bank, when you privatize coffee and sugar, that obviously was controlled by the oligarchy, but now it's completely controlled by outside forces, right? Telecommunications become privatized, electric companies become privatized, pensions and other businesses become privatized, right? So you privatize these businesses that are oftentimes foreign capital, and you cut the social services of people. So the wealth of the country is being taken, right? So again, the development of finance capital in the country, the development of maquiladoras, and we could hear about many organizations that are working with people in maquiladoras that don't, what they get paid is nothing, and they're heavy exploitation, right? The growth of a large service sector, right? There's a large service sector. So instead of a productive economy in El Salvador, there's a huge service sector economy, right? The dollarization of the Salvadoran economy, and for those that are not Salvadoran, dollarization means that the Salvadoran currency is the US dollar, right? So the Salvadorans make $5 a day. So think about $5 a day, right? A gallon of gas costs $5, right? So like this currency development in El Salvador to benefit the elites, right? The passing of free market policies or free trade policies at CAFTA, the flexibilization of labor, meaning that labor is not, the strength of unions is taken away, right? That you're contractual, right? The development of a huge informal economy where people rely on the informal economy rather than the formal economy, right? The elimination of agricultural production, right? El Salvador imported products make 60% of what people consume, right? So 60% of what people consume is imported, right? So those that control the importations are making the wealth off of those imports, right? So when we look at the political structure of El Salvador, and right out of these statistics from 2015, there's a 4% of a large bourgeoisie that controls the country, and a very small middle class, right? 6.3% of the population. The development of agriculture, as I was mentioning, only 18% of the population actually works in the countryside or as peasants, while 75% are proletarian, are working class. Right? Now, this is not taken into account. Excuse me. This is not taking into account the informal economy and domestic work, right? This is actually when number 4 of 75% of the population is talking about people that are actually employed in the formal economy. Right? But there's a large sector of the informal economy, of domestic workers, right? Of people that are still, we could still consider them working class, right? But when we look at this pyramid here, it's more illustrative of who controls the country, right? And I would want us to think about, when we think of this production of this moral panic that I'm talking about, it's not these folks that are producing that narrative or that are producing the policies to respond to conditions. It's them up here, with support from this group here, right? So it's a small sector of a fraction of the society that make the decisions of the country, right? Hold on, my phone keeps on going off. Let me turn it off. Right, so this period, this development of the situation, right? To respond to crime. So after the peace accords end, you see, again, the restructuring of Salvadoran society to a neoliberal state where there's no support, there's no social safety net for people. People have to figure out how to survive on their own, right? Crime starts to emerge. People being robbed, people stealing, right? And to respond to the crime emerging from this immiseration, the Salvadoran government under Arena passed the Private Security Service Law, right? So again, using the market to solve problems. They create private security firms. Right? They allow for private securities to develop. And if you go to Salvador, you see a private security guard everywhere. Alongside military, you see private security guards, right? And this happened in 2001. That proliferated an industry of private security whose profits in 2003 reached an estimated 82 million and soared to 319 million in 2005. right? So from 2001 to 2005, there was a $319 million profits for private security, right? Again, instead of creating a welfare state, right? Because at least a welfare state would provide social democracy. We had a neoliberal state developed after the war, right? And this state provided policing, criminalization, right? And private security, rather than social programs, healthcare, education, public infrastructure, right? Social development, social capital, human capital development that's about for the people, right? Education for the people, right? Instead of that, we have the development of private security firms. Right? And the oligarchy that once controlled the country necessarily hasn't gone away, as we see this percentage. Instead, they've developed and they reorganized themselves into business groups, like Grupo Cuscatlán, Grupo Banicrogla, Grupo Banco Salvadoreño, Grupo Banco de Comercio. All these are finance capital that control the country, right? That rule the decision-making in the country. So, under these conditions, right? Again, I mentioned the war, the revolutionary process, right? The displacement and refugees to LA, the neoliberal restructuring of Los Angeles when refugees showed up, right? The development of a neoliberal state in El Salvador from the 90s to 2010, right? Under the period of Arena, right? Arena is the National Republican Alliance, right? The leftist, the right-wing party of El Salvador. You also have the development of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 1996. And prior to that, the mass deportations of Salvadorans back after the war, right? Because the argument was, well, if the war's ended, you no longer need to be here, right? And there was very little that received refugee status. So a lot of people that were deported, right? Between 1998 and 2007, more than 74,000 Salvadorans were deported. And I was mentioning, a lot of these that were deported had this imputed gang identity. They were seen as gang members, right? They were seen as criminals. Like you must have done something wrong if you were deported, right? So once they arrived to El Salvador, the deportees arrived to find other youth who had been abandoned after the war, who were denied the promises of the peace accords, a chance at a peaceful and tranquil life. Instead, they were criminalized and had to deal with poverty and the psychological trauma of war on their own. The deported and abandoned youth of El Salvador had to find a way of survival within the logics of neoliberalism, right? I want us to think about that, right? That you had to figure out on your own through the logics of neoliberalism, which is figured out on your own. Because of the rise of instability in the country, given the conditions of a neoliberal state in the 90s, people started to feel insecure. A lot of research argues that people felt even more insecure after the war than they did during the war, right? And one of that was because of crime, or this fear of crime, right? And obviously there was people that were actually dealing with it, and it was media that was promoting the idea that there's a huge crime wave and it's these deportees that are bringing the crime, this gang culture to El Salvador, right? And so you have in this moment the development of La Sombra Negra, which were the death squads that were happening in the 80s that were killing revolutionary and teachers and unionists, right? And mothers and children, start going after gang members, right? And start saying, and deportees, and start saying that they're going to cleanse the nation, right? Of this lacra of the society, right? They need to get rid and social cleanse this population, right? And as was argued, right, a 1996 Amnesty International report found that some of members of La Sombra Negra were former soldiers with some tacit support from the police department. The extra-legal violence by the police and the death squads did not alleviate the violence emerging from gang violence. Rather, it allowed it to continue unabated, right? So the development of a police force after the war, which I forgot to mention, right? So there was the development, after the war, they developed the National Civilian Police, right? The argument was that this police force was not gonna be the same as during the oligarchy where they had the military in the streets. It was gonna be a national civilian police that was a percentage of the military, a percentage of ex-guerrillas, and a percentage of the civilian population. But unfortunately, the majority that run the police force were ex-military, right? So they still had this perspective of war in the way they run the country. So you still had this violence emerging from the police. And alongside the violence of the police, there was the violence of the death squads against these youth that were developing, right? In one of the interviews I did with Alex Sanchez from Jueces Unidos, he had this quote that I think is very important to think about in this moment. He says, for the first time, once he was deported back to El Salvador, and when he arrived in El Salvador, he saw the conditions, right? And he said, for the first time, I saw something I'd never seen. Not about the death squads or the violence, but the gangs. Both MS and 18th Street saw the general common people as the enemy because the enemy did not fit the profile anymore. They were killing each other. They weren't killing civilians. But because the death squads came in, they were civilians. And they didn't fit the profile of a gang, especially since they wore ski masks and were former military as we understood. So all of a sudden, civil society became the enemy. This was a direct result of the death squads. And it changed the whole way gangs until this very day look at the civilian population, right? So as some of the other researchers were arguing, right, the development of the state and the extra legal violence of the state through the death squads exacerbated the violence. There wasn't any prevention, right? It was rather the promotion of violence because the neoliberal state was about violence, right? So this development started producing this panic over, again, crime, right? This situation where people were dealing with the situation in the working class neighborhoods, and their only solution, the only solution they thought was allowed was policing, right? Was extrajudicial violence, right? The only solution was to get rid of social cleansing these gangs. Now, the degradation of the working class was framed as a gang problem, right? So instead of framing the degradation of the working class in El Salvador through neoliberalism and the expansion of the global economy, right? The neoliberal state, it was framed as a gang problem. And we had multiple presidents, and for the sake of time, I won't take all of it, but there's multiple presidents that started creating mano dura policies to go after the gangs and saying that this is a solution to our problem, right? We just need to go after these gang members and lock them up, right? And get rid of them, right? And this was with support from the United States, obviously. And I have a picture here of Antonio Villaraigosa, who was the LA mayor, who was at the same time also very supportive of stop and frisk community policing models in Los Angeles, right? So if you know of Antonio Villaraigosa, he was the one that also applied broken windows policing in Los Angeles, right? In this period, during his time, he visits the presidents, right? And we have a picture there of, I'm glad I forgot his name right now. That's good. I'm glad I just forgot his name. Tony Saca, like, there you go. There is his name, Tony Saca, who's currently got caught with stealing a whole bunch of money, which most capitalists do, right? And there's this quote that he said that Antonio Villaraigosa argues, right? That these gangs are transnational and we've got to work across borders, smart and in a multi-pronged way. Suppression, prevention, and intervention, right? Now, I wish this idea of prevention existed. I wish this idea of preventing people from participating in violence and actually really caring about public safety, because that's the concern, right? We all want public safety, right? Instead of that, we saw suppression, right? We saw the development of the relationship of the US state and its local state, Los Angeles, involved with the policing in El Salvador, right? And we have a laundry list of policies that start to develop these law and order politics, right? That are very racialized because of the development of what we think a gang member is. And I remember when I was in El Salvador doing this research, there was one year that I was there that I was, again, I like watching Fox News, so I want to watch the right-wing media in El Salvador. What are they saying about the problem, right? And there's this moment where they have the chief of police, who's also one of the owners of a private security firm, right? So think about the conflict of interest, right? Head of police, owner of a private security firm. So they're interviewing him, and they're talking about, well, what do you think about the gang problem situation? He's like, you know what? This gang problem comes from broken homes. And I'm using the word broken homes, but in English, in Espanol, it says familias sin padres. Familias que no son cristianas, right? Not Christian families, non-Christian families, right? Families that are broken because of migration, right? These maras surge right there. They develop right there. And they have a culture that's poor, right? And we just need to attack that culture. We need to teach those family values, Christian values, right? So again, creating this idea that the gangs, the Amaras, were like this demonic figure, right? That Christianity needed to vanquish, right? That the police was the state and they were going to take care of them, right? But this construction, again, of a culture of poverty. And I was, again, as someone that studies law and order and racism in the United States, I immediately thought about this report called the Moynihan Report. And the Moynihan Report was a report that was written in the 60s by Patrick Moynihan, who was a sociologist, that argued that the problems of the Black community wasn't that they lacked civil rights or that they lacked racial equality, is that they came from broken homes and they were predominantly led by single female-headed households. So the problem of the Black community was female single-headed households, right? So as I was listening to this guy on the TV, I was thinking like, man, this sounds like the Moynihan Report. The way you're talking about these impoverished communities, you're the reason why, because of your private security firm making all this wealth, you're blaming their problems on themselves. So right, so blaming the poor for the conditions, right? Blaming the poor for their impoverishment, right? So, and the thing is that this became very hegemonic. Dominant, right? Instead of using the word hegemonic, dominant. It became common sense for people to blame the poor. But then instead of blaming the entire poor, a sector of the poor, a sector of that surplus population, the gangs, the maras, right? These youth that don't require intervention and prevention because they're irredeemable, right? We can't prevent them from joining gangs. And once they're there, we got to just get rid of them, right? And one thing I remember when I was interviewing a police officer in El Salvador, he said that. He's like, we can't do intervention and prevention work here. Our role is not to prevent them joining or intervene. Our role is to uphold the law, right? And these policies then start to develop, right? The Ley Antimara, Mano Dura, Super Mano Dura, Plan El Salvador Seguro, Medidas Extraordinarias, and I'll describe them in different eras because all these come from different moments in El Salvador, but from the 2000s on, right? And different political parties. But all these policies had that repressive aspect to them, right? Whether it was Arena during this period, and even FLN had to respond that way too, which I will get into in a bit. But these policies were forced, again, law and order, right? We need law and order in the society, yeah? And it was using the moral panic of the Merero to uphold these laws, right? Now the US alongside it created all these other policies and programs, like Operation Community Shield in the United States, right? The Transnational Anti-Gang Initiative, right? The Central American Law Enforcement Exchange, where they were sent police officers from Los Angeles to El Salvador to Los Angeles, and do ride-alongs and learn how to police gangs, and pretty much how to police poverty, right? The International Law Enforcement Academy that I mentioned, the ILEA, right? The Emerita Initiative, the Central American Regional Security Initiative, the Alliance for Prosperity, right? A laundry list, right, of laws and policies. Money, millions of dollars that are spent to produce criminalization. You know, and I always share with my students, like, think about all that money that's spent on all these programs and all these policies, right? Where could they have gone? How could they have been distributed differently in our communities, right? Y'all are all in debt because of student loans. Y'all work full time, even 2 jobs to come to school, right? There's a huge housing crisis, right? We don't have to mention the word gentrification. There's all these conditions where instead of the redistribution of wealth going to the people, they're going to these policies. And what upholds these policies are this moral panic over the gangs, right? Because what we see as they're developing all these laws that have been happening since the 2000s, we haven't seen a decrease of violence. We haven't seen a decrease of people joining gangs. It's continuous. The violence is continuous. People are still migrating because of these conditions, right? So all these policies, and again, I'm gonna go through them, but if you have the article, they're written there. So I know this is a lot here, but if you have the article, you can look at them through the article. In 2016, I visited the Anthropology Museum in San Salvador. And, you know, I was just doing my research and I was like, oh, I want to visit the museum. You know, I visited the Anthropology Museum in Mexico. Let me go visit the Anthropology Museum in San Salvador too. So I was there visiting. And to my surprise, they had a whole exhibit on migration and reasons of migration, right? And they said the 3 main issues are gangs, earthquakes, and flooding, right? And so in the bottom here, I know it's kind of blurry, so I'll mention it. The transnational phenomenon of gangs, or quote unquote maras, started in the beginning of the 90s, influenced by deportations of young Salvadorans from the United States. According to the ACNUR, which is the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Refugees 2014, in El Salvador, gangs and drug traffic or organized transnational crime are the main causes of inner and external population displacement, making the numbers of refugees increase since 2008. Right? The main causes. Yeah, at the surface level, if you ask people, why did you leave? The gangs. Why did you leave? Poverty. But what are the relations that create those things, right? Even when we look at pandillas, terremotos, and inundaciones, right? We know that earthquakes exist, yes. Floods exist, yes. But the way we respond to them is political, right? The way we respond is the crisis, right? When we think of Katrina in the South, that was a political response. That was a crisis. When we think of Haiti, of Puerto Rico, those are political responses to crisis, right? So even if there's an earthquake in El Salvador, it could be prepared, right? But if you have a neoliberal state that is not about social reproduction, that is not about providing for the people, but rather for the market and private property, of course there's not going to be a situation to create a social safety net. If there's floods, obviously there's floods because you create the conditions through extractivist policies, right? Through companies that create the exploitation of land that creates flooding. Yeah. So all these conditions, right, are the root cause of it, are them, right? Rather than looking at the capitalist relations of exploitation, we're looking at gangs as the problem. Yeah? And so it has these in the numbers, right? We talks about gangs and forced displacement. Again, these are real situations. This is not like they're making up these numbers, right? But what happens is that once these numbers are out, we reproduce the idea that this is the root problem. Yeah? Instead of everything I mentioned of CAFTA, of the maquila industry, the informal economy, pretty much the capitalist state, right? That gets pushed aside and we focus on this, right? So again, if we look at these numbers, it mentions all these people that have been displaced because of the gangs. So that was just really interesting to me to see, like, wow, there's a museum exhibit dedicated to gangs, right? And the construction of, again, this moral panic that this is the situation. So in 2009, there was a response, right? And there was an electoral response because people were feeling the neoliberal crisis in the country, and there was a political response where the electoral response was to elect the leftist government of the FMLN to take power, right? And that was the first time ever that the left took power, or not even took power, but just took the presidency in El Salvador, right? And it only lasted for two presidencies, two terms, yeah? So, and we'll get into this idea of a two-party system and Bukele breaking that, right? That's totally, doesn't make sense, right? Because it only lasted 2 terms. But in those 2 terms, there was attempts to try to do something different, right? There was attempts to develop social programs, right? There was an attempt to provide an analysis of the root cause. But that became politically insecure because the idea of even talking to gang members, even trying to work, for intervention programs, social programs for youth that have been criminalized, it had become so solid that you can't redeem them, that they're the reasons why we're so stressed out in this country, and you want to provide to them? Like, provide for me, right? I have no work, and you want to give them a job, right? Because again, this neoliberal system had, again, devastated the economy for the majority of the working class in El Salvador, that when they tried to create this, they started seeing this as a problem, right? The media and the right-wing government were really pushing against a potential change of how you handle the situation. And the turning point was in 2010, I think, when there was a burning of a bus, right? A bus was burnt down with people in it and were killed, right? People died. And they argue that this was because that gang members did this. And so there was an upsurge of like, what are you gonna do? Leftist party, what are you gonna do? Are you all gonna provide social programs to these people that are just killing us? So they had to respond the same way that everyone else has responded, right? And then to say that, I'm sure there are some people within the party that were like, yeah, they've always thought that way. But the attempt of providing social programs was pushed off because the response that people wanted was a military response, right? In the same moment, there was a development of a gang truce, right? In 2012. A gang truce between the MS-13 and Mara 18 gang, right? 18th Street and MS-13. And the truce was arguing that we're no longer going to kill each other because we realize that we're just hurting the country and we want to change, but we need your support to make the change, right? No one took that seriously, right? I remember I was here at a rally in Los Angeles with organizations that wanted to support the truce, and we're calling out, you know, everyone in civil society and the government in Salvador to uplift and support this truce, figure out how do you support it. But there was a lot of skepticism behind it, right? That it was who was leading it, Who's behind it? Who's monitoring it, right? Are they really doing a truce, or are they just hiding the bodies? Like, there is all this skepticism around it because, again, this construction of the marero as a criminal, as a terrorist, right? Deal with him, right? There is that famous dictum of, we don't negotiate with terrorism, right? This construction of the marero that way, you couldn't deal with them that way, right? Yet at the same time, there was, because of these truces, there was violent free zones. So these areas where the truce started to exist, we started to see these violent free zones, right? And it wasn't through heavy hand or militarization or repression. It was through the actual happening on its own, right? But no one was uplifting it, right? Everyone was seen again with caution, with doubt, right? In this same moment that this was happening, the US federal authorities labeled MS-13 a transnational criminal organization. That has never happened for a gang, right? A transnational criminal organization. And that allowed for them to freeze assets of the gang, supposedly, in Los Angeles, in the United States, right? But think about it. There is a development of a potential change of how you deal with the problem coming from the actual problem itself. The US State Department responded by saying, nah, y'all are a transnational criminal organization. And once they're labeled that, you don't work with them, right? You don't work with a transnational criminal organization. You know, in this moment, there's a lot of, you know, development that starts to happen that I have two colleagues, MS students, Joana Beltran and Nalia, that developed their own research that argues that there's some people that didn't want militarization, right? That actual statistics showed that some people, if you really actually asked people, like, would you want the military or would you want social programs? And a lot of people would say, I want social programs, right? But when you bring up, do you want social programs for Maras? Do you want social programs for this certain sector? That's when things change, right? So like the construction is very powerful. The development of this transnational moral panic is very powerful over this gang, right? So what ends up happening instead throughout this period that I'm talking about is what we call punitive populism. And this idea is not necessarily mine, but it's sociologists study this idea, right? Of a punitive populism that's developed in it. And what is this? It could be understood as a development of public support, policy making, and political campaigns aimed at deploying severe criminal justice policies, increasing harsher punishments, regardless of their ability to reduce crime or rectify its root causes. Regardless of their ability to reduce crime or rectify its root causes, right? That it just turns into this populism about wanting hard hand policies, right? That it just, once you hear who these policies are directed at, people want that, right? And so this development of this punitive populism goes alongside this transnational moral panic because people see that this is the only solution. The neoliberal state doesn't provide social programs. The neoliberal state provides repression. The neoliberal state provides prisons, right? Provides police, provides militarization, all for the sake of the global economy, of the private property and the free market, yeah? So punitive populism emerges as a response to the degradation of the poor, right? To the problems and conditions of the poor.
Stephen,
yes.
Sorry, just quick time check. It's a little past 8:30 and we have several questions. So
cool.
whenever
Okay.
you're ready, we can jump into that.
So I'll finish soon. So, okay. So this whole period starts to develop again, right? The development of unaccompanied youth. And I remember in 2014, right, all this started happening, right? And there was the response again, people are fleeing poverty and violence. And then this was another moment that started made me think about this. Like, we're focusing on a condition of a root of the problem. It's only a condition of the problem, right? We're getting stuck on here, but it became common sense for a lot of us to say, right? The caravans that were coming in 2008 and have been coming, right? The Central American caravan, same thing, right? That it's the violence and poverty, right? Violence and poverty, yes, but we're not critiquing the actual structure itself that's continuously producing these problems, right? And in this current moment, what do we have? We have someone that says that they're going to have a new path for El Salvador, but it's continuing the same policies, right? He has this thing called the Territorial Control Plan. It's a new name, sounds catchy, but it's still mano dura, right? It's still policies that are locking youth up, that are extrajudicial killing youth, right? And again, because of the problems of the society, people see that this is the only solution, right? Yet this goes alongside the US strategy for engagement in Central America, which is the new policy that's developing alongside Bukele. Now, obviously in Los Angeles, there's a response to that. Just like in El Salvador, there's a response to Bukele and this ongoing criminalization of youth, right? CSPES and organizations have been uplifting social movements, the feminist movement in El Salvador that's spoken up against Bukele, right? The labor movements that has been spoken up against the IMF loans and stuff that's happening right now, right? So there's an ongoing social movement responding, right, to these conditions that recognize that the root cause are not gangs, right? And for me, I want us to end with this, is that El Salvador today, before anything else, is the creation of that barbarism. I firmly believe that all the rest is just makeup. Trimmings, candy to keep the people quiet. It's possible that the style of the rulers have changed, but the basic manner of thinking that it still governs us today goes back to the slaughters of 1932, right? Miguel Marmol survived the matanza. And in an interview that Roque Dalton did, which I really recommend the book, Miguel Marmol, he says that what we see today, and this is, he was writing back in the 60s, but this is relevant today, right? That what we see today is still a creation of that barbarism that we saw, right? Our solution through punitive populism, right? To not talking about the root causes of capital that produce these problems, right? And so for me, as a Central American studies scholar, I really want us to think about that as scholars today, that we have to have an open anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist Central American studies, right? Because to understand the conditions of our communities, to understand the root causes of our communities, we have to have an anti-imperialist framework, an anti-capitalist framework, right? And our Central American studies should be guided by that. And I have this quote from Roque Dalton. I'm not sure who the artist did of this meme, but laws are created to be followed by the poor. Laws are made by the rich to bring some order to exploitation. The poor are the only law abiders in history. When the poor make laws, the rich will be no more. Right? So to end, you know, I want us to remind us that there's other ways of learning more about what's happening, right? Jennifer Cárcamo made this great film, Eternos Indocumentados, that was collectively done, right? And she's the head of it, but a lot of people supported to make this documentary. A lot of people in El Salvador that give you the analysis that I'm talking about, right? But more so than that, I also want you to support organizations, right? I would love you to either support or participate in these organizations, right? Homies Unidos that does great work in the with youth that are criminalized here in Los Angeles, right? With the unaccompanied youth that are here. The Human Rights Alliance, right? Organization that I'm a part of, right? That we work with refugee families, right? So if you don't want to participate or be part of organizations, the student organizations on your campus, at least you could donate to the work that we're doing, right? And the links are right there. And again, thank you. And I speeded up the last part of it. I was going slower than I thought, but just I want to leave my email there. And I really want y'all, you know, read the article, email me. You know, as an academic and as work with students, I really like listening to what students have to say. So if you're a student and you have any questions, any comments, you know, email me, save my email, and let's talk. You know, I love to correspond with folks, right? And obviously during this moment in quarantine, we'll have to do it through Zoom or through email, but you know, that would be great. So I'll leave it at there so we could open up to discussion. Thank you.
Hi, that was a very great talk, very agitating, very educational. One of the questions from the chat is from Jimmy G, and they said, being raised in this condition, they noticed that our elders were focused on survival and how the Central Americans 2.0 or the second generation struggled finding identity because they were focused on survival through Americanism. The question is, why do so many of our elders lose that community development and teach the new generation to be individualistic? And what should we do about it?
It's a big question, right? Again, you know, as a political economist, someone that studies the economy, right, that sees the conditions of our society really predicated on the way we produce. I mentioned this idea of neoliberalism, right? I really want us to think about neoliberalism, and again, it's not an academic term because social movements use this term, right? And then unfortunately in the United States, we don't use it as much as social movements in the Philippines and Latin America use it. You go to protests, it's all over their billboards, all over their signs. But what neoliberalism teaches us is individualism. And as the person, what was the person's name that asked?
Jimmy.
Jimmy. Well, Jimmy was asking, right, of our elders of teaching us about survival. Well, that's what neoliberalism does, right? That if you're living in impoverished, degrading situations, you have to survive those situations, and you have to do the best to survive them, right? Because again, this idea of survival of the fittest is fundamental to neoliberalism, right? So our migrant community that arrives to the United States gets caught up in that situation, and it's not again because they want it, because that's the society that they come into, right? So they leave a society that's falling apart because of war, of a revolutionary movement that could have taken it farther, but they come to the city of Los Angeles that's falling apart, right? That people have to figure out how to survive, and that just becomes part of who we are at this moment, right? But neoliberalism again is a ideology, politically, economically, and ideological, right? That influences how we think of the world, right? And so I really do want you to study that, Jimmy, right? Study what neoliberalism has done to us. Okay? And again, it's socialized, right? It's not like, oh, I want to be neoliberal. Maybe some of us admit that I want to be neoliberal, but most people, it just becomes socialized. It becomes part of how we think of the world, right? Of this whole idea of, like, for example, of how many likes I get in my Instagram, of how many tweets I'll get, or how many retweeted, right? Of becoming a social influencer. All those things are oftentimes very neoliberal because it's really individualized. It's not collective, right? So that really becomes a part of who we are.
Okay. Hi, Professor. So the next question is by a professor at CSULA, Alex Villalpando, and their question is, what is your advice for the next generation of Central American Studies scholars? What are the best practices to think of not only their research, but their teaching work in and outside the classroom? Should they be dangerous?
Should they be dangerous as far as the scholars? Well, first of all, I want to say that, what's up to Alex? Me and Alex we go way back, right? We are scholarship and our discussions about Central American studies, right? But again, like I said at the end, right? I think we have to have an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist Central American studies, right? That we shouldn't, and I say open, right? Meaning that we shouldn't hide away from the critique, right? That we shouldn't hide away because we're worried about what kind of funding we're going to get, what kind of popularity we're going to get. We should be openly critiquing because, we should have a preferential option for the poor, right? And this was liberation theology, what Ignacio Martin Baró was talking about, right? What Monsignor Romero was talking about, right? What Rutilio Grande was talking about. That our analysis should have a preferential option for the poor. And so I think for any scholars that's listening, anyone that's writing right now, we should start from that analysis. We should start from that analysis, and we should conclude from that analysis, right? Our conclusion should lead us to that point. That this is for the poor. This is for the wretched of the earth, right? And how do we organize, and also how do we participate in the movements of the poor? Because we shouldn't just be, academics that don't participate. Like I was mentioning earlier, right? That a lot of my scholarship and my thinking has been influenced from the collectives I participated, right? So my thinking is collectivized, right? It's thought through the ideas of others, right? And it's built, obviously, as the academic, I'm the one that's writing for tenure, for all these other things, right? As a professor, and so I write them, but I want to always acknowledge with the guys' ideas where they come from, and they come from social movements. They come from us arguing, but at the same time, I'm part of these movements, right? I don't see myself detached, and I think we need to do that, right? And it's easier said than done, right? It requires a lot of self-criticism, right? There's a Marxist analysis of criticism, self-criticism. We require a lot of that, right? That we have to oftentimes rectify our mistakes and how we participate and what we do. Right? So I think my suggestion would be that, right? That when we do our work, we do it with the oppressed in our minds, right? And that we should seek always have liberation in our thoughts, right? When we write. Any other questions?
Okay, we have a question by Mirna Solorzano.
Yes.
And she saed that Homies Unidos was started in El Salvador, and we are working to have prevention and interventions for deportees and those youth joining the gang in El Salvador. Our members were constantly harassed and was hard to work with the government. Now, more than ever, is hard because anyone who works with the Maras will be persecuted. What can we do to have a better program in El Salvador?
You know more than I do, Mirna, right? It's Homies Unidos. I think but thank you. Shout out to Mirna, again, someone that's really influenced how I think about this process, this idea, right, about these conditions. And again, it's got to, and at the end of this article, I finish with this last point that I say, for now, a leftist collective response and mobilization that returns to a materialist analysis of crime and transnational criminalization of weights. And what I mean by that is that we have to have a political analysis of crime, right? What is crime? Why, how do we conceptualize crime? At this current moment, we conceptualize crime as mareros, but we don't conceptualize crime as maquilas exploiting our people. We don't conceptualize crime as the fact that they don't want to pass that law to make water a human right. That's a crime. The fact that Salvadorans don't have water as a human right, that should be seen as a crime. And there should be popular protest, right? There should be a public uproar that access to water in El Salvador is bad, right? It's intoxicated, right? So that should be a crime. But instead, what we think of crime has been really influenced by how capital wants us to think of crime, right? And what I argue with my students in my classes is that one of the oldest tools of capitalism is the conception of crime, the conception of crime, right? Because if we go far back into the enclosure movements in Europe, right, the development of capitalism in Europe through the enclosure movements, the people that were pushed off the land, the peasants that were pushed off the land for the enclosure movements to happen, were then considered vagrants, just like the indigenous people in El Salvador. These vagrancy laws were a way of criminalizing those that once were on the land, but now we're seen as people that were criminal because they were living off of trying to survive off of the land, right? Not only to mention how women were criminalized and condemned witches in that period, right? These were forms of early criminalization that haunts us to this day. So when I talk about MS-13, what I think of as MS-13, I think MS-13 is neoliberalism's great contradiction, right? Because the idea of neoliberalism is, again, to survive on your own. Well, its contradiction is people are going to survive on their own, but you're not going to like how they're going to survive, right? Because neoliberalism, that's what it's done. So I think, Mirna, to answer your question, I think we got to continue organizing. Y'all did great work with Homies Unidos, and we need to amplify that work. We need to amplify the work that organizations like CSPES are doing, right? They're calling out the social movements, uplifting the social movements in El Salvador, right? Again, the FMLN in that period of its presidency tried, right? It did try, but at the same time had to follow the same logics of punitive populism because people were demanding that, because they were up against the oligarchy of the country. Controlling the presidency does not mean controlling state power. You have to have an analysis of the state. It's not state power just to win an election, right? For me, again, in the larger perspective, when I think of this anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist perspective for Central American studies, I come from a socialist perspective, right? As Anak Bayan was talking about earlier when they introduced themselves, right? We come from a socialist perspective, right? El Salvador, the attempted revolution in the country was to develop socialism, right? It didn't get there. Doesn't mean we can't continue to hopefully strive towards that, right? This current moment, Bukele, is totally the opposite of that. Right? We're seeing him continue the neoliberal policies. His first presentation after he won the presidency in El Salvador was to the, oh my goodness, I just forgot the name, to the Heritage Foundation. There you go. Right? The Heritage Foundation is a conservative right-wing think tank in the United States that pushes a lot of anti-people policies. He came to talk to them. He didn't come talk to progressives, social movements. He came talk to the Heritage Foundation and tell them that El Salvador is open for business, right? So he's only amplifying the neoliberal policies and continue by saying that he doesn't support Venezuela, right? Obviously saying all the things that the U.S. would want to hear, but think about who he's aligning himself with and who he's separating himself from, right? And that's we're seeing that situation happening. So I think your shorter response is to continue organizing and uplifting these critiques, right? And mobilizing our communities to see this, because I do think there's a lot of people that accept this, right? Because again, they've become the folk devil, right? The Maras have become the folk devil of our problems. And as you mentioned, it was really hard to do intervention work in a country that doesn't see you as almost human, right?
Stephen, we have a question. It's a little bit complex, but I would love to ask this. This is from the Central American scholar and researcher Kelly de Leon. Many indigenous groups who survived the war in Guatemala and in El Salvador demand the imprisonment of these war criminals. How do we work with them while also having an abolitionist framework?
So they're asking, can you repeat the question? That they're asking for how do we have an abolitionist framework to what's happening in this country?
I can repeat the question really quick. Many indigenous groups who survived the war in Guatemala and in El Salvador demand the imprisonment of these war criminals. How do we work with them while also having an abolitionist framework?
Well,
so pretty much how can we seek justice through the system that we have in place?
Well, again, the idea for me, the idea of how I've learned abolition through is the idea what I've been talking about, right? That abolition is not just about just getting rid of everything and starting from scratch. It's built. It's to get rid to build, right? So the abolitionist idea is right to eliminate these systems of exploitation and to develop systems of care, systems of social good, systems of social development, right? So to call for justice for these people that caused harm could develop off society, to me, off of that, right? Because I get the idea of abolition is that we shouldn't incarcerate anyone, right? But we have to deal with, like I was saying with the Maras, right? People want justice, and their form of justice is incarceration, is policing, is because that's all we know, right? That's all our solution. But we do need to call. We can't compare, for example, the Maras to these war criminals created genocide. That's a whole different situation, right? But the idea of abolition, again, for me, is to build, right? To get rid of systems and structures and policies of exploitation and build systems of care, of socializing healthcare, of socializing education, right? Socializing housing, right? So I think they coexist alongside each other. So I think in this moment of practicing that, and I think it's been really interesting to think about this idea of abolition when thinking of El Salvador, right? Or thinking of Central America. Because a lot of folks could be abolitionists in the US, but it's hard to think as an abolition towards what we see in Central America, right? To think that you could that you need to lock up everyone that causes harm, right? And again, this is a larger transformation of society that we need. And again, I'm coming from the perspective that we need to transform the society into a socialist society, but that needs to transform itself. It takes time, and it takes social movements to build that, right? And revolutionary movements to build that. But to get to that, right, we're going to have to figure out those periods, and that's going to be difficult. And that's going to be done through social movements, I think. Right?
Our next question is from Shirley Cordova, and looking at the FMLN as an example of wanting to take a different approach, and it not being accepted as a common sense. What work needs to happen to fight this hegemonic moral panic, and how to respond to the critiques similar to those the FMLN received?
We just got to continue doing the work, right? It's the organizing on the ground, the conversations. I think I always used to tell the students I organize with, and even to the students to this day, the hardest conversations to have is with our family members about these topics. And I get it with Filipinos, right? With Duterte, the support of Duterte. It's really hard to talk to your family members that actually support these responses, because again, it's not that they're not. I don't think at the end of the day they embody that politic, but they think that's the only solution to the problem, because there hasn't been an alternative. And unfortunately, the FMLN, because of internal contradictions that they've had, also strong media and strong oligarchic control of the country, has not allowed them to develop an alternative. So when people hear FMLN, they think that they were like, that's the alternative? No, that's not the alternative. Right? There is no alternative, right? And again, I go back to neoliberalism. The idea of neoliberalism from Margaret Thatcher was that there is no alternative, right? Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister of in Europe, right? She argued that there was no alternative, right? That neoliberalism, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the end of the so-called end of the Cold War, there was no alternative. Free market capitalism is the way, and that's influenced us. So to try to an alternative requires grassroots efforts, right? And efforts at all different fronts. So that's why, like I was arguing, for example, as an academic, is that our work should be anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and openly say that. We could have our debates from the left, right? Would you choose an anarchistic route or a socialist route, or it's up to. But at least those debates need to be open and discuss those things and really make those an alternative. Because there's all these statistics about millennials being open to socialism in the United States. Let's build off of that, right? Now, I have my criticism of that because I think the conceptions of socialism might be limited to what we've been said in the United States and not what we learn from third world movements or socialist movements historically. But I do think again that requires for us to do the groundwork. Surely, we got to build and organize and teach these critical ideas and have the difficult conversations. Most importantly, the difficult conversations with the folks around us, because we're only stronger as strong as the folks around us, right? If the folks around us are strong, then we're strong too. And I mean strong politically, right? Thinking politically about the conditions around us. So I think political education is key to this. But politically education grounded in movement building, right? Because it just can't be stuck to a classroom, right? It's got to be on the ground, building with people.
I have one question. So some of our members are asking, like, how do we protect the youth, especially like women, trans, queer folks who have been oppressed classes in El Salvador? And especially, how do you continue to heal or forgive them for their actions, especially those who have been directly affected by the gangs?
Yeah, that's the hard question, right? And that's what we deal with when we talk to people that have dealt with these situations. I remember when I was doing this research, I was in Mexico City, and I was staying in a hostel, Casa de los Amigos, and I met a trans sex worker who had left El Salvador because of the maras, right? And she dealt with violence from the police, and she dealt from violence of MS-13. And, and I was talking to her, and I was asking her, like, what did you think about the conditions, And she's like, I left that place because of these gangs, and they need to be eradicated. I'm like, like, whoa, like I go. She's like, the society wants to eradicate me, but they also need to be eradicated, right? So it was really interesting to see the conditions there, right? That because of all those things I've been talking about, that people are placed in these situations, right? And then once you're in these situations, how do you forgive that? How do you forgive that violence that happened to you? I can't ask someone to forgive. All we could do is try to change the conditions now. You can't ask someone to forgive. You can't ask that. You could. People are going to have their own process of this situation. And again, I think that's what makes it so difficult of a topic, right? When I was writing this, it took a while to write this, to even like work through it, right? Because it's such a hard topic to work through, right? Because it's such a big issue in our community of violence, right? But I think, like I was saying, that when we only talk at that level, which is a difficult level, we miss the bigger picture that created these problems, right? And we'll never get to the bigger problem and build a movement against the bigger problems if we're only there, And again, this is we could never excuse the feelings of people that went through these things, but we also have to understand that those objective conditions have to change, and we can't change those objective conditions if we only focus on eliminating the so-called problem of the maras, right? Because you can just continue to have more youth get involved or forcefully involved, right? Because you're not changing the political economy of the society, how the society produces, how the society provides for the people. That's not changing. So we're going to continuously see forced migration, and we're going to still see displacement until those conditions change. And I don't, I'm pessimistic in the sense of relying on elites to do it, but I'm optimistic that movements could change these conditions, because we've seen horrible conditions change before through movements.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Professor Osuna. I'm going to pass it to Alfredo now. Thank you for answering those questions. We unfortunately couldn't get to them all. There was a lot of questions, but we'll definitely be sending them to you so that those people, they have their email, whoever asked the questions, and we'll send them to you with as well as with the comments and everything. And thank you for everyone who participated. And I'm going to head it to give the conversation to Alfredo.
Can I say one last thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Again, hit me up, right? Email, I really appreciate when students respond, send me emails and tell me what they thought about the work, right? Because again, like I said, this is collective, right? This is a conversation, right? This is not the last word, right? Our analysis is collective. Our analysis is ongoing until we get to the root problem and until we change these conditions. So please email me. Let's connect. Yeah, support the Human Rights Alliance, support Homies Unidos, right? And peace, y'all.
Is Alfredo still on?
I think we're actually going to pass it on to Anak Bayan, who's going to share with us a little bit about our next event, which is a follow-up to Stephen's talk. Somebody from Anak Bayan?
Hi, I am Arlo. I'm from Anak Bayan, UCLA. And yeah, there is another event with Unica and Anak Bayan on May 27 at 7 to 9 p.m. It's called Karapatan at Kalusugan, Rights and Health. It is a political situationer on the Philippines and overseas Filipino workers. Unica and Anak Bayan is working with Migrante International, an alliance of Filipino migrant workers all over the world. And yeah, our speaker would be Joanna Concepcion of Migrante International, and we hope y'all can go there. The link is bit.ly/phsit. I think Alan can type it out in the chat. But yeah, I hope to see y'all there, and it was nice to see everyone today. And thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
And just really quick, we also have another event the upcoming Wednesday. Unica is organizing a talk. It's going to be actually in Spanish. We apologize for that. It's going to be about dissidents and art in Central America. We're going to host a Central American artist, El Crack. He's widely known because he's very, very political and critical about the issues that Stephen been talking about today. So I think it will be great to follow the conversation next Wednesday. And we're going to be sharing the link and the register link, also the flyer and the register link if you want to join us at the same time.
So I think that's it. Thank you, everybody. This talk was recorded. We will send out the recording and the follow-up email along with the announcements that our compañeros from Unica and Bayan shared. So please feel free to follow up there with those details. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now.